fine.
Okay, I won't be able to join the chat, but I can at least see what they are writing, so that's good.
Yeah, we can.
Let's do that. Yeah, I won't distract it with anything else.
Perfect. And I think we are live, yes. Okay, so hello everyone. We already have a whole bunch of comments, so thank you everyone for joining. And I also know that a bunch of people aren't able to make it today, but will watch later. So hi to you as well, who join later in time. You know who's here already today. He's if you're into the sword community and or love swords in one way or another, you probably have heard of his name. And I'll let Peter introduce himself directly because he'll do a way better job than I can. So Peter, thank you for joining.
Well,
And
thank you for the invitation, Gabriele. It's an honor to be here. It's a joy to spend an hour or so, perhaps, to talk about swords. Great fun always. So
yes,
my name is Peter Johnsson. I'm a swordsmith. I've been at this since actually before this millennium. I started my professional career as a swordsmith, if you can call it that, at 1999 in the summer after completing a 4-year training in decorative metalwork. And ever since, I have been working full time with swords in one or the other way. I um, I work as a designer for Albion Armorers, and that started actually from the very, very beginning. I was been incredibly lucky in getting a contact with Howie already during my metalworking training. And we made plans, and eventually they panned out to be the next generation of swords and the museum line, the Maestro line. So I've designed over 200 swords for Albion in various lines. The only swords I do not engage with for the Albion line are the special project ones, the film swords and so on. Even though I at one time I even made a drawing for the Conan sword that Jody that just scrapped because he didn't like it. So I can't claim
ouch.
any honor there. But Albion has been fantastic to work with over the years, and it's a continuous sort of some siblings in arms, if you like. I also spend quite a lot of time working with museums, being an ever ongoing pilgrim to visit museums to uh, study and document swords in their collections. Visited numerous sword museums over the years. The Deutsches Klingen Museum in Solingen is one of the more important ones, but also museums in Sweden, the Royal Armories. I visited many of the English and some of the museums in the United States as well. And this is very much at the core of what I'm doing, and I think we will have a reason to return to that. In the last couple of years, I've been venturing into other fields than strictly doing historical reconstructions and studies of swords, and then I'm trying to find other paths forward, and that's another thing we can talk more about, I think.
Absolutely. I think, I think they're all very cool points. But maybe then the first thing is why swords? So if you start with
Mm.
metalworking, what brought you to this object
Yeah,
specifically?
yeah, it's a very good question that is very difficult to answer, but it was never my plan to be a swordsmith. It's sort of I more or less accepted the fact when it came true. But looking back, it's not such a strange thing, perhaps after all. My parents, my mother and father, they were both very interested in history and archaeology. They were interested in mythology, and they are both well read. Well, my mother has passed away, but my father is still around, and they were fond of telling stories by heart,
Hmm.
and they liked to tell me about the Odyssey and the old Greek mythologies, the old Norse mythologies, but also interesting books that they made into their own mythologies. And we often made outings to places in the landscape around where I live in Uppsala. Um, and we called these places like Viking spots. The landscape around here is like a very flat mud pancake. It was for like 2 millennia ago, it was much more crisscrossed with waterways. And even further back in time, it was actually an archipelago. So today, what is like fields and for growing crops was actually open water. So if you went on an outing to one of these rock outcroppings, you could very easily imagine being on an island. And perhaps for your inner eye as a child, you saw the big war canoes of the Bronze Age paddling across this field of wheat with the wind making waves, and they were coming up to the rock and pulling up them on the shore, and hopefully dropping one of their swords in the ditch there. So
Yeah.
my younger self went there looking for Viking swords and Bronze Age swords. And that was the
I'll,
beginning, and it sort of never stopped.
yeah, and I'll assume you never really found one, or or did you get
No,
lucky?
to my great disappointment. But, however, all of these fantastic treasures that the stories told about, they are still to be seen, and you can go and see them in the museums. So you can see the sword Tirfing, you can see the spear Gungnir, you can see these things. They are on display. The pieces that the stories are telling about, these fantastic objects, the fabulous neck piece of the goddess Freya. It's in display in the historical museum in Stockholm. If you have a little bit of imagination, it's there. And for me, it was obvious. You could see it, Brising Garden, and this really fueled my imagination and made me fascinated in uh, storytelling and myths and history and archaeology, and how this imagined world that only exists in our mind but still exists connects to this world that has ceased to exist, but still exists in these objects. And then there is this very interesting connection between what isn't and what is, and what can be imagined on many levels. And storytelling has been a constant part of this ever since these objects were made. And storytelling, being a swordsmith today, is actually part of the trade, part of the craft still. So
Yeah,
it forms a continuum, if you like.
yeah, and I think this is probably especially visible in your more recent work, the Goddess series, where
Hmm.
I see a lot of resonance with what you're telling about objects that tell a
Hmm.
story. But maybe
Yeah,
before we go into that, which is
yeah.
the more recent part, when you talk about objects telling a story and being built in a way that kind of connects, and it's not just an object, it's not just a piece of steel that's shaped in a sense, or iron. Maybe one of the things most people will know you from are those drawings of swords with a bunch of circles and
Oh, yeah.
kind of, and a lot of people, actually, one of the questions I got the other day when I mentioned this live stream was maybe ask them what those circles mean. So I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
it's not clear to everyone, and yet when
No.
you start understanding it, it really opens up incredibly interesting world. So maybe we can
Yeah,
start
let's
from that.
let's let's talk about that. So before I did my training in decorative arts and got a bachelor of art in metal design, I actually in my early 20s I got a Master of Arts in Graphical Design and Illustration, and my focus then was book illustration and classical book typography. That was my main interest, um, which also obviously connects to what I already presented. Um, so my goal when I started out to seek a profession was to become an illustrator of children's books, and I did work with that for a number of years. And in the training. In classical art training, one aspect of this is actually classical design. And when I talk about classical design, it is really design principles that were used already in the classical times of ancient Greek, engineering and art. And it goes even further back than that. We're not talking about a new age mystical secret teaching. It's nothing like that. It's actually a very practical, hands-on method of visualizing mentally how something comes together. And today we are very used we're sort of, the habit is to think in inches or fractions of inches or millimeters and centimeters. And we think about dimensions. But the classical way of engineering and designing is much more reliant on proportions. So what's the difference? Well, when you look at dimensions, you think about how something relates to a standardized set of measurements. If you think about proportions, you think of how something relates to something else in proportional size.
Mm-hmm.
And the actual final dimension can be decided later. If you have a proportional design, you can scale it up and down. The proportions, the relationship between the parts remain the same. They are scaled up or scaled down.
Almost like vectorial graphics in a sense.
Yeah, it is. You see the same effect when you zoom on the screen when you work on a computer. It's exactly the same thing. It's just that when you work with proportional design, you learn, you internalize a system of thinking that is based on modular units and or geometrical constructions.
Mm-hmm.
And this way of relating to design has been part of many, I would say most of the more advanced crafts over a long time of history. And this is not in dispute. You know, even still today, if you're working with sheet metal to put metal sheeting on roofs, you need to have a basic understanding of geometry to be able to lay out the shapes on the plates before you cut. So it's nothing more strange than that, really. It's just that how you apply the geometry and modular thinking will vary slightly between the different crafts and arts. But there is a lot of crossover. So if you go for a classical art training, you know, artists, they use a tool to size things up. They put the arm out and take a measurement and see how many times can you see the head go in the shoulders. You know, you get a sense of proportions in the place you're studying. As a designer or an artisan or engineering, you can decide that this thing that I'm building will have a certain width and a certain height, and the width and the height can relate to each other to a whole number ratio. Or you can decide that no, the width of the thing will be the full circle. And then I will make a series of circles where the center of next circle cuts through the middle of the first one, and so on. And you build a series of circles. And then you can modular it up. It's still going to be a modular design, but you're already introducing the basic geometric construction. So you first circle sort of the whole layout of the piece you're making. And then inside this set of circles, you made a series of subdivisions with whole number divisions or geometric cuts. And what the geometric cuts will allow you to do is to introduce proportions that involve irrational numbers, such as the golden section, √2, √3, √5. It's not calculated, but it's drawn with diagonals and arcs. And when you get two lines crossing, you have a known exact point where you can make the center of a new circle or the point of a new diagonal and so forth. So it's a hierarchical system of building blocks that are constructing with whole number units, divisions, multiplications, or geometric cuts. And this, you can study this for many years, and to be a master of this, it takes a little bit of getting used to it. It's like studying a language and internalizing the structure of a language to be able to speak it fluently. But I would say it's easier to do with geometry and modular thinking than it is, for example, to learn German, which is nearly impossible.
Yeah, and for I think anyone having trouble visualizing this, what Peter's saying is true. Even if one good example to visualize it, I think, are cathedral floors. Often they have these very complex geometric designs, and when you look at them as circles and intersections of circles, suddenly these patterns start making sense, and that's how they were designed. I think the question for me is, did you get to this kind of by assuming, by knowing this geometric
Mhm.
approach and saying, oh, this might apply to swords, or by looking at swords and thinking, oh, I kind of see a pattern here?
Thank you for that question, because it puts me back on track. So, my having studied classical layout, which is really a modernized version of the craft of the medieval scribe, you decide the proportion of the page and the proportion of the text, the
Yeah.
proportion of the area of the text, and everything according to a modular or geometric system with diagonals or units. That's just how it's done. And when I then started to document swords, it struck me that one of these sort of, let's say, strategies or themes or favorite tricks of these classical designs is to involve the golden section, for example. It's not
Mm.
the one and only, but it's fairly common, and it's rather famous. And I must confess, at that time, I was a little bit of a cult follower of the golden section cult. So I tended to look for it everywhere. It is there, just
Mhm.
not as dominating as you might think. But if you see it very clearly manifested in a sword, like the width of the pommel to the width of the guard is a fine manifestation of the golden section, pretty precisely. And then perhaps even the width of the blade to the width of the guard is yet another golden section manifestation. And if you see this repeated in several swords, it starts to flag, like, this is strange. It's so precise and it's so common that it seems strange that it should be just coincidence, because there's strictly no functional reason for it. You can make a
Mhm.
well-balanced sword without these proportions. So that put me on the track that maybe the people who made swords were schooled in the same way that people who made books in medieval times,
Mhm.
or architecture, or fine furniture, or goldsmiths we
Yeah.
know use these kind of methods. So uh, during the first 10 years of design work for Albion, I calculated these proportions with a pocket calculator to get swords to look the part, not just have the proper balance, but actually have the proper proportions to look like the originals.
Mhm.
But I knew whatever they did, they didn't use a pocket calculator. So they must have had a very direct method of doing this that was possible to do with very simple tools, and also possible to correlate to your actual practical work with simple tools. Um, and the only really way to do this is with some kind of geometric layout, or some kind of use of the compass and the straight ruler. That's how it's
Mhm.
done in all the other crafts. But to find the way to do this took me more than a decade
Mm.
of testing and correlating to my drawings, and scrapping ideas that were too fanciful and didn't work. Then I had an assignment for the local chapter of the Freemasons to give a suggestion for the sword of the master of that chapter. And I thought, I'm going to make them happy, and I'm going to design this just like you design a cathedral, because we know a little bit of how that's done. So
Mhm.
I wanted to do this with a series of circles, and I choose to use 10 circles because of the 10 commandments.
Mhm.
And I wanted to use the first circle and make a square around that circle. So you have the circle and the square. They are symbolically important. And when you have two circles that cut through each other's center, the distance in that almond shape is
Mhm.
actually one side of a perfect equilateral triangle inscribed in the first circle. So then
Mm.
you could have the square, the circle, and the equilateral triangle. That's beautiful. And it also so happens, if you draw a diagonal from the corner of the square to the very end of the middle of the last circle, it actually touches the corner of that triangle, which seems very
Mhm.
nice. So when I drew that out, I I had to decide on a scale, and another customer had made a request, an initial request, to have a sword reproduced that is kept in the National Museum in Copenhagen, in Denmark. So that sword was sort of in the back of my mind, and I knew it had a guard width of 17 centimeters.
Mhm.
So I constructed up this drawing so that I got the side of the triangle being 17 centimeters. And when I then measured the full length of these series of 10 circles, the hairs in my neck started to rise up, and I felt a cold shiver because it was on the millimeter to the
Mm.
given length of that sword. And
Wow.
furthermore, it was also the exact blade length of that sword. So then I had 3 dimensions that fitted a very strict geometric layout. And with these layouts, it either fits or it doesn't. You can't just make the triangle a little bit wider or the circles a little bit wider. It either fits or it doesn't. It's like the
Mm.
key in a lock.
Mhm.
So I had to go to Copenhagen and verify the measurements. So I documented that sword and went back and made a further analysis of the proportions. And I could find a geometric system that defined all the parts of that sword with very few geometric cuts, involving one of them involves the golden section. And this is
Mm.
the Sörborg sword, which is part now on the museum line of Albion. That was the first sword that sort of made everything fall into place,
Yeah.
because I recognized the layout system from what I've seen on the layout drawings of Gothic cathedrals, and it also resonated with what I knew about book design and composition and proportionality of sculptures and other medieval art forms. So it felt very sort of that this is very reasonable. It once you get how things come together, it's easy to make.
Yeah.
I can show it to you with pen and paper, and you will get how it's done. It's very much more difficult to show in your hands like this. So the next task, of course, was to go back and see, are there any more swords? Is this a fluke? Is it just a coincidence? But I
Mm.
could see a limited number of layout, like openings in a chess game, layout uh, structures that fitted 8 out of 10 swords. And I saw repetition of a limited number of, let's say, geometric and modular strategies that were used in also a repeated pattern of combinations. And over the next couple of years, I worked with this in secret because I couldn't talk about this until I had it more verified. So the next 2 years was in a rather insane haste to go through all these things and read up on medieval design and verify with architectural history and art history and a little bit of medieval philosophy to see what did they really think about these things. So I'm not just
Mhm.
making a new age idea of this because it looks cool. So
Yeah.
that was like the beginning of this. And ever since 2010, this has been at the core of what I'm doing for several reasons, because I do believe that there is a good reason to think that this was actually how it's done. It's not very different, or actually, it's not different at all from what you see what goldsmiths or architects or makers of musical instruments or book artists were doing. They are
Mhm.
doing exactly the same thing. The only new thing is that someone is crazy enough to suggest that maybe swords were also made just like other medieval crafts. And
Mhm.
for some people, this is very upsetting because they think the sword is only like a result of functional criteria. Everything in the form of the sword is a direct result of its functional demands, which is a
Yeah.
nice thought, but it is mistaken. It's not the case that form always follows function in the sword. That's a very modern way of thinking about design. Many When we talk about function, it's the tactical function as the sword, as a weapon.
Yeah.
We then forget about an important function of the sword is also to display and manifest ideas of its role in society and cosmology. The sword is a religious artifact.
Mhm.
It carries mystical and religious importance. We know this. It's obvious from its descriptions and decoration. And it also goes, as I then suggest, even to the design of its underlying proportions. And because this is a way of thinking that decides the floor plan of, let's say, if you build a chapel for martyrs, you want the floor plan to be 8-sided, because the number of 8 is the first number of the 7, which is the full week. So number 8 is you begin again, just like the martyrs begin again in a new state of life, as elevated to martyr status. When you baptize, when you bring someone into the Christian church through the baptism, you do it by pouring water over the head from the baptismal font. That's why they are very often 8-sided.
Yeah.
So the shape of an object is a kind of a software, if we like, to program its intended function, its symbolical meaning. It's part of its shape, and that is a very medieval way of thinking.
Yeah.
For us, it's a bit alien, but when you do this as an artisan, as a craftsman or artist today, it's like putting on medieval glasses, and the world looks a little bit different, and you start to appreciate things that before seemed like either you had to make up an explanation that this is because the sword is intended to be used in this very special way, and that's why you have to have exactly this width of the guard. Or you see that, well, actually, the guard relates to the hilt as inscribed in an octagon. Maybe that's actually more important.
Yeah, and it can be very dangerous to try and apply modern approaches to studying antiques, because the thing that comes to mind now that you're mentioning this is, for example, the Cinque Dea and the attempts to explain it as a weapon used in alleys. And it's like, yeah, maybe, but
Yeah, it will
maybe the
work like
shape.
that.
Yeah, of course, but a knife will too. So,
Yeah.
but the shape is probably telling something that maybe we lost to time, or it just says something about status and stuff. So, in this view of putting on these medieval glasses, let's say, and trying to understand the mental approach or even the practical approach, have you been able, through your method, to also kind of rebuild the process? Like, do you know what the starting point would have been in designing a sword, or is it just a matter of
Well,
proportion?
I have ideas, of course, and you get clues when you read design manuals from the period. They are actually written, but by architects. And in one case, a goldsmith, Hans Schmuttemeyer, wrote a little handbook of how to design pinnacles. Because when you make a reliquary as a goldsmith, you have to be a little bit of an architect. So you have to know about the principle of Gothic architecture to make a proper reliquary. And he describes a use of modular units. And it just so happens that there is a sword in the Wallace collection that could be a textbook example of applying the very exact principle of Hans Schmuttemeyer, but in sword design, which is really nice. And then you have Roritzer, a Czech or Bohemian architect, who showed how you can make, like, you decide a basic unit, a basic module, and then you make a series of subdivisions. This is the square, of course, and arcs and subdivisions. And in this, then you can dimension all the frill work, the shape of the pillars, the moldings around this, the windows, all the, like, the edge pieces, all the sort of architectural details are then made in a scale to each other proportionally inside this unit. So if you made the church slightly larger by increasing the width of that first square, everything else will be enlarged proportionally.
Yep.
So one of my sort of tongue-in-cheek names for this method is the secret seal of the swordsmith, because you don't have to make a full drawing like I usually do to demonstrate how it comes together. Because if you know how this is done, there's no need to make a drawing. You sometimes you can make just the first circle and the first square, and then make the divisions you need for the parts. So you use the octagon for the guard, use the golden section for the blade, use the triangle or the 6-pointed star for the pommel. If you draw all of those figure out, in this basic thing, and you make with your pointed compass on the wall of the workshop or on a plank which is chalked, as you work, you can take all your measurement from this piece. When you decide the blade length, you know it's a multiplication of the radius of the circle.
Yeah.
So
So
there's no need to make a blueprint. And for verification in your work, you have it there. You just take it with the compass. And as every metal worker know, if you're working with hot metal, a compass is very handy to measure with, because it's not damaged by the heat of the metal.
Mm-mm. So it's almost like you can create a sort of pictogram of each sword in its
Yes,
proportions in a
yes.
essential kind of
It
image.
makes
That's
a
really
great
cool.
T-shirt. It makes a
Yeah,
great T-shirt.
exactly. Absolutely. And that's the designer mind
Yeah,
coming out. By the way, we have a bunch of comments of people saying hi. And I'll just let everyone know, if you don't already know, feel free to ask questions as you go.
yes,
No
please do
need
that.
to wait, because I already have a bunch myself, but I want to keep space for
Yeah,
everyone's. One question, let's say, if I put my skeptic's hat on, then
please do.
is how many original swords have you seen? Like, what's the proportion of swords that follow this approach, and which ones don't, and why?
So I've measured something like 300 swords carefully. And then I'm talking about tracing the full outline and taking measurements and point of balance. I mean, the whole thing with the functional design, that is sword dynamics, it's a completely different chapter. I need to stress
Mhm,
this. You
mhm,
cannot make a well-balanced sword by using geometry. You can't.
mhm,
It's what balance happens in the third dimension, the distribution of thickness and the cross section. It's not about geometry. So
mhm,
geometry and sword balance, geometry and sword function are two completely different things. That's important to understand, which is a further reason why they may have done it. So okay, so back to your question. Among those sort of 300 plus swords that I've studied, you have Bronze Age, you have Roman swords, you have later period swords, but the bulk of it, more than 200 swords, are from Viking period up to Renaissance. And this
mhm,
is the period where this method of working is most sort of core, um, because it correlates to contemporary European culture the closest.
mhm,
And among this body of swords, 8 out of 10 very closely falls into one of the three geometric layouts. And you can also see a grouping between sword types where you see a repetition of certain geometric or modular strategies. For
mhm.
example, swords made south of the Alps tend to have a slightly different approach in the design, favoring more a modular system, not using so much geometry, while north of the Alps, geometry is much more popular and modular approach is less important. This is
Okay.
actually precisely reflected in the architectural traditions north and south of the Alps. So it is, if you look at it statistically, there's too many swords that fit to a limited number of layouts for this to be really feasibly explained like, well, it's just adding circles until something happens. If you say that, you don't really understand
Yeah.
how you develop modular or geometrical design.
And in your opinion, the 20% of outliers, why do we have those? Is it badly designed swords? Is it?
No, I couldn't say. There's also like the pressure on me is to use very tight tolerances.
Yeah.
If I allow like half a centimeter overall, I can't prove anything,
Yeah.
because then you can allow anything, of course. So I have to have much stricter. If it's much outside 2 millimeters, I have to say, well, maybe not intentional. On
Mhm,
the other hand, what bites me then in the neck is that if I apply too strict rules, maybe I have to develop too complex geometries to explain these deviations. And
Hmm.
this is the difficulty with the situation. By going back, you can never be dead certain that this is exactly the method they used for this precise swords. That's why you need to study many swords to see, well, there seems to be a grouping here. What
Yeah.
happens if I apply this principle that seems to be common for these swords on this outlier? Can I accept this deviation and then it actually conforms to what is common for the type? Well, maybe then it's an argument to be a little bit less strict about that precise sword.
Yeah.
Um, but it is a method of working. It's definitely a hypothesis in development. I'm just a single person. Even if I have more than 200 swords to work with, it's a very limited number. But
Hmm.
I'm happy to see that other people are starting to apply this in their analysis using the same basic sort of strategies and the layout principles, and they seem to come to very much the same conclusion. I see the same patterns being repeated in their analysis.
Mm. This is really interesting. And speaking of outliers, one thing that comes to mind, again, talking
So
about,
sorry, outliers.
yes,
So the 20% that doesn't fit,
yes,
okay, maybe the blade was shortened.
yeah,
And maybe the sword is rusted, so you can't really say.
yeah.
Maybe it was rehilted in a time crunch. Maybe you just had to make it functional. You cannot think that this has always to be the case. That would also be unrealistic. So
Hmm.
some slight variation of 20, 30, 35% should perhaps be seen as a realistic situation. If this is like the typical way how swords are made, you would have to expect, some swords deviate for any number of reasons.
Yeah. And this reminds me, when you look at like mosaic or cathedral pavements again, there's the sometimes mistakes when the observer didn't look at the geometric pattern like you're describing, but looks at the components. So, for example, instead of
Hmm.
looking at circles that create an almond, they look at the almond and try to reproduce a sequence of almonds,
Yeah,
and
or
that
draw a circle
creates
by hand.
exactly.
And
So,
it's good enough for that situation. So yes.
yeah, and which reminds me also of the Ulfbert imitations that get
Hmm.
worse and worse the further
Yeah.
they move. So sometimes when you don't. So anyway, let's move into a few of the comments and questions because I see them coming in. So the first was by Slobodan Marinic. So thank you from Serbia, and he mentions it would be interesting to hear about mathematical sword too. So I imagine in this sense. Um, well, I'm not sure what to imagine. So
Yeah.
Slobodan,
Okay. Yes.
feel
There
free
is
to.
there is actually there's a little interesting instance there. I was at the Wallace collection. Toby Capel was my generous host. We had put forward a few interesting swords, and I was just trying to make the most of my time and documenting them. And then he comes with a little smile saying, I think you'd like this email. And he shows me a printout from an editor of an Elizabethan play called the Weeding of Covent Garden. And it's one of those sort of, comedies, common street gossip and what everyone laughs about at the time. And it's about a young law student who has wasted his father's stipend on the usual stuff, wine, gambling, and women and fun stuff. And and he's deep in gambling debt to all his friends and enemies. And to his horror, his father makes a surprise visit. So he has to make a play of having all these rowdy gambling debtors and student friends dress up as law students and having a very learned discussion about the intricacies of law in his dingy student chamber. And they bore the father stiff, who finally has just to kick them out and say, give me some air, let's get out of here. And the father's sort of motivation is you shouldn't waste time reading books. Go out to the street, learn from people. This is the true knowledge of life that you need to have as a lawyer. That's sort of a comical twist. So he says to his son, now, on with your cloak and sword and follow me to the tavern, because you have a sword, don't you? Oh, yes, father, says the son. So show it to me. Where is it? It's under my bed, sir. Well, bring it out. So the son takes out the sword, and it's a sorry excuse of a sword. And the father says, "Fie! That's a lawyer's trick, all right. Make his sword companion with his piss pot. Here's a tool." And he gives the son a bag of money. And the son, like, ah, nice. Buy you a good sword, one with a mathematical hilt, as they call it. Question
Hmm.
mark. So the editor wrote to museums all around in the New World and Old World, asking all the curators, so what's a mathematical hilt?
Hoping for an answer. Yeah.
And Toby came to me smiling. I said, I think you're going to like this. So this is one of the very, very few suggestions that there is something like the mathematical hilt. And there's really no other, well, let me know if you have another explanation for it.
Wow, that's
And of
really
course,
interesting. So,
this is the joke of a play in the early
mhm,
17th century. We should
yeah.
remember that. So in my imagination, I'm seeing there is now, an old school sword cutler who has found a perfect marketing tool for the young
Mhm.
blood, saying, but this is a mathematical hilt. It's much better, much more harmonious, and the, you know, macrocosmos and microcosmos. And look at this, just like what I'm doing and
Yeah.
trying. This is it's marketing, and people think, oh, this guy, he's full of himself, mathematical hilt.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of the laugh at the town at this stage. That's why they included it in the play. It's a comical point, but it does refer to something.
That's super interesting. Thank you, Slobodan, for giving the uh, opening for this
Yeah,
conversation.
thank you.
We then have a comment by James Elmsley. So still
Yeah,
going back to
a
earlier.
part is, so he says, have you looked at geographical origin of examples which do and don't correspond to geometric principles, particularly where those don't fit in, come from? So, well, apart from north and south of the Alps, where there is somewhat of a trend, uh, it's very difficult to say, because honestly, it's very difficult to say where a sword was made, other than rather wide geometrical sort of, or geographical. Well, this seems to be in the style of, it seems to be an English sword. This seems to be a French sword, and that may be true. But when you it's difficult to see this kind of subdivision in regions. There is more of a trend throughout history. So you have the wide guard, short hilt, Brazil nut, early swords of the 11th century. They tend to follow a certain type of layout. Many of them, I guess, are Frankish, Germanic, belong to that tradition. So maybe that is a tradition that belongs to this geometrical or geographical area. I don't know. What you do see is that this if I'm correct in my suggestion that at around 800 or slightly before, by the time of Charlemagne, this is what you see. There's a change in the making of swords in Europe. So swords start to look like knightly swords, apart as opposed to Viking swords, because before then swords looked like Viking, what we call Viking swords, all over Europe, with slight local variations. But then all of a sudden you have these sort of armory style swords with very simple blacksmithy, very just a straight stubby guard and a D-shaped or a round pommel, hardly even file worked, very, very basic. And they are made in the hundreds, even the
Mhm.
thousands. And they have ulfbert or ingelry. And when the blades are exported to the north, they are given luxurious hilts, yellow, silver, bronze, uh, luxury goods for the very elite. But in Europe, these are armory swords made mass production.
Mhm.
So that's another discussion. Are these the best swords ever made? Well, they are perhaps the most swords for a certain time period made, but that's a different thing. But when you see them made in Europe, they have this holistic geometric layout with a pommel, and the point sits comfortably in a series of circle with a simple geometrical layout for the hilt compartments or hilt
Mhm.
components. When you see these blades mounted with Norse, that is unchristian hilts, there tends not to be this holistic overall geometry. The hilt can have a nice sort of system of modules or even a geometrical construction perhaps, but it tends not to fit the overall sword.
Mm.
And the reason for this, I think, is that by the time of Charlemagne, bishops and abbots were by law, their duty was to supply the king with weapons. They were the guys who could organize large-scale production of things because they could read and write and plan things. So they were duty-bound by law to supply the king with weapons. This is the same time where they come up with a book with pages, when they invent an alphabet, what we still use in print, when we start with Romanesque churches. This is like a neoclassical period, a kind of renaissance.
Mm-hmm.
And this is exactly when I think you see this holistic modular geometrical layout being used for swords that start to look like these very severe, strict, and sort of low-key, but very beautifully proportioned cruciform swords of the medieval knight.
So and we'll get to the rest of the comments right away. I just have one question. If we look at the way we tend to look at swords being produced, we tend to think now that, often at least, that we have this separation of specialization. We have blade makers, we have hilt makers, we have grinders. In practical terms, how would the geometric harmony of the sword be maintained in, let's say, pipeline, in a production pipeline that instead requires so many different people and shipping
Well,
of?
it's actually to facilitate such a production. Because if you
Hmm.
have a basic unit, it's very easy to communicate just how the parts needs to be made. You can make templates. You can send to the bladesmith even a string with some knots on telling overall length, blade length, and blade width. You can give them some part of the layout system and say, our basic unit is this, the blade is a multiplication of this or a division of that. So it is actually a way to communicate fairly exactly how parts relate to the overall and within themselves. And especially if you have a bladesmith and a hiltsmith and a sword cutler being active in different areas, the sword has to come together somehow. And if you live in an age without millimeters or very exact fractions of inches, how can you do that production unless you have a system of dimension and proportion?
This makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that. We had one question about outliers again, and I think this is a professional bias from the Latrix. So he's mentioning epidemiology of outliers. This actually brings me to a question. Do you think modern data approaches will be able to help shed more light on this theory or on this approach of
Maybe.
yours? Do you think?
Maybe, but then again, as we know, when you feed AI shit, you get shit. So
Yeah.
it's very much depending on what data you feed in. And I've thought about applying some kind of statistical calculation for this. I even for some years reflected whether I should do this as a PhD work to get it properly sort of vetted. But in the end, that wasn't the path for me. I choose to use it as an artistic expression instead and as a way to understand the sword. But I've talked to a mathematician and whether he could think of some kind of statistical system to test this idea. And he said, statistic is the wrong approach because you're very much dependent on your preconceptions or your questions. It's much better to look at the material as it is and draw conclusions from that. And what you can draw conclusions from is, do you see a repetition of certain solutions that corresponds also to certain types? Is there a combination? Is it not just sort of like overall length and blade length and hilt length, but is there also in the same system then a correlation to blade width? Is there like a hierarchy of correlations in a simple system? The more correlations you have in a simple system, the more strongly you can argue that this cannot be just coincidence. And if you add to this that there is a repetition in the kind of layouts and the kind of strategies being used, the case grows just stronger. So according to him, what I have presented is in itself a strong good argument that it's not just coincidence, but there actually may be something to it.
Yeah, makes sense. We have comment by Eric of Winter Cutlery. So the outliers could be explained by manufacturer with less rigor than Peter
Yes,
designs.
of course. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I mean, we can talk about the correlations and the departures from these correlations for a week. And I mean, this is a huge area of study. It can be a serious case area of study. It should be argued. It should be doubted. This is why I bring it forward. We need to learn this. I think it's a mistake not to look at the sword as being part of the general medieval material culture. Why would the sword be an object that is made differently than other important parts, other important crafts, other important objects? Why is the sword different from the chalice that you take the Holy Communion with? Why is the sword different than the house you live in? Why is the sword different than the musical instrument? If you can argue that the sword must be different, well, I really want to hear those arguments. If you cannot find a good argument for that, then the next task is to find what we know about medieval design principles and see what kind of patterns can we see in the surviving material.
I agree. Now, here's an interesting question too. So, would this principle also be visible in Japanese or Islamic weapons?
I have no idea. You
Okay.
tell me. You need to study many hundred swords and apply what you know about Japanese and Islamic aesthetic, philosophy, religion. It has to fit an overall system. It could be the case. It doesn't have to be the case. As I say, a sword doesn't have to have these proportions to be a really good sword. It just fits to the time and period we're talking about.
Cool. And I realize we have so many comments. We're going. So, how does the geometry theory apply on pre-Christian swords?
It doesn't. Not in the same
Perfect.
way, because this is a very Christian way of designing sword. However, if you find enough Roman swords that have both hilt and blade well preserved, which is usually not the case, you tend to have either the hilt or the blade. If you can find enough Sparthas and Gladius and see, would Vitruvius design this sword? I think he would, or he could describe that design principle. I think there is reason to think that Roman swords would build on a kind of a modular system, and I would love to see that. I can make a very Gladius-looking Gladius using principles described by Vitruvius. It looks and feels and handles like a Roman sword, but of course I can't say that, yes, this was how the Roman swords were made, because there aren't enough surviving that we can actually analyze them. Bronze Age swords, there is enough going on in the intricacies of their shapes and proportions that I think there's something going on. But it wouldn't be the Christian sort of Judeo-Greek philosophy combination of mysticism and philosophical thought that gave birth to Christianity. However, there could be earlier roots of that philosophy present in Bronze Age swords. You definitely see the use of compass in Celtic metalwork. It's all over the place. Why wouldn't they use that also in the design of swords? I couldn't see a reason for it. But then again, that's a whole new field of study. You can't just because you've seen a pattern in medieval Christian swords, let's call them that, you can't just assume that the very same method is used for Celtic swords and Bronze Age swords. Perhaps something similar. That's absolutely possible.
A different symbology, maybe, like the different proportions of different.
Of course, there are different numbers. There are different reasons to use certain numbers, certain shapes. I know Roland Varseja has found a
Mhm.
very interesting combination of geometry and modular units in Bronze Age hilts, a few that he's shown. I've seen the same in some Bronze Age swords that I've analyzed, but I haven't gone sort of public with this because it's just a few swords. You can't really say much until you have a good number.
Yeah. What would that good number be? Is it the 200-300 you've studied, or what's
Even
your
that is
threshold?
really too small.
Yeah.
I've told about these ideas for German historians, and they just say me, where are the numbers? And they're not happy
Mhm.
with 250 swords. It's way too few to suggest anything, according to
Yeah.
German historians. And I can only say yes, I understand your argument
Yeah.
there, but let's keep measuring and let's keep analyzing and see if this is disproven or if it can be developed.
Makes sense. So James Elmson again follows up on the mathematical hilt.
Yes,
So
of course.
there, yeah,
It's the humor of the old fashioned. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, you get the joke.
yes, and James is also now a literary critic. That's very cool. Slobodan, again, thanks for the nice story about mathematical sword. It would be really nice to know more about sword design from medieval sources.
Yeah,
Um,
I'd love to know.
So, because you mentioned sources as in architecture and goldsmithing, but there's no document that we know of, even just
Not
through
that
the
I
name
know
or
of.
something. No.
Not that I know of. We have some alchemical texts from like the Renaissance talking about how to heat treat swords. We know like from a very tele lens description of how smiths work, but there's nothing in detail like this. Uh,
Okay, then we have a comment by Cristobal Perez Verdugo. I hope I mentioned it correctly. Now, you mentioned that in the north, sword had Viking form, but in Europe they became cruciform. So, why do you think swords evolved this way as a functional or a cultural expression?
I think it's so. I have a when I talk about the development of the sword, I like to show an image where the design of the sword, the shape of the sword, the making of the sword is a result of many different factors. You have craft traditions, you have how you fight, why you fight, the role of the sword in society, the scale of economy, access to material. You have what kind of, is it a civilian and military weapon? Is it civilian or military weapon? There's so many factors, and each of them in many ways are equally important. So you can't say like, yes, the straight guard on the medieval sword, it's a cross. You simplify it to a level where you might as well say anything. So that there is a change. One aspect, I think, is that let's make a sword that is made as quickly as possible because we need to make many. Let's make a sword that can be made quickly and to a certain level. Good enough. And that the typical sword for good enough, in my mind, is the Ulfbert sword.
Mhm.
And at that time, you have a straight guard. It's not super long. It's a little bit longer than the Viking sword, but not much. And you have a sort of the D-shaped guard, which is a sort of simplified shape of the 3-lobe or 5-lobe pommel. It's sort of functionally still the same, but it's made quicker. Uh, the Ulfbert blade is made from a high carbon steel that may not even be heat treated because it's sort of decently hard enough as it is.
Mhm.
And you don't have to run the risk of getting it brittle from heat treating with the grain boundary carbides that you see in these blades. They are actually not that super quality that they are sometimes made out to be. At least there is reason to doubt it.
Mhm.
The situation is, as always, more complex than it sometimes is made out. So I can't really give you a nice and neat explanation why swords started to look like this. I think one reason is production. One reason, of course, is perhaps some subtle changes in how they are used in fighting. And we don't know that, so that has to remain a speculation or very careful testing in practical fighting, you know. And then, of course, there is the influence on how they are laid out. If you start to think about the sword as a very abstract shape, defined with a few very simple parts, the end product tends to take on that kind of character. It's a natural result of having a simple geometrical layout. The parts tend to look a little bit more simple. That's another explanation, but I'm sure we can find a dozen other explanations as well.
I want to quickly mention, you mentioned Roland and his work, and one thing that we talked about when we had our chat was about the asymmetry he sees in swords, so the tilt of pommel. How do these fit in the geometric design, in the sense that, in a sense, they are more 3D, but of course, is it enough to alter the geometry in a sense, or
It's
does it fit
not
within?
actually. It's not actually.
Okay.
So the parts can still have a very precise proportional relationship to each other, even if they are a little bit offline.
Okay.
If they're a little bit crooked, they are still in the same very. I shouldn't use the term very precise because that's not the mindset. But let me just first state that proportional design and proportional strictness isn't sabotaged by slight wonkiness.
Okay.
So why is that? Okay, let's think about calligraphy. My teacher in calligraphy in my art training, she was extremely skilled and very, very strict. And you have to learn the humanist minuscule, you have to learn all the kind of typefaces that you use as a scribe, and you have to learn them so you can almost do it in your sleep. And then they start to look correct. But they're not really beautiful until you can start to write them with a certain speed. And with calligraphy, that term, that character in script is called ductus, which means flow. So you have to learn something and internalize it so you know it very well. The shape, the proportion, the curve is very clear in your mind. And when it is clear in the mind, it becomes effortless for the hand. And when a letter is written at a certain speed, maybe all the A's, all the letters are slightly uneven in height if you measure them. But visually, it looks like a perfect beauty.
Yeah.
So we have to make a distinction between perfect precision and symmetry and a perfection of beauty. They are not the same. That's why a beautiful sword made for a king can have asymmetries, but it's made with a very highly developed sense of shape and proportion. But it's also made with speed, because even at that time, the customer was not the most patient of people. So even the king will say, well, I expect my sword now because I have a hunt to go to next week and I need my sword now. So just there is this time crunch, this aspect of time crunch that we have to also see in the work. We also don't know the limitations. Maybe they didn't have the full set of tools or the perfect material or enough fuel. There can always be shortcomings that has to crunch the work somehow.
Yeah, that reminds me of Misaglia in Milan with armor, because he went to France for making the king's armor, but of course he couldn't take his workshop or
Yeah, yeah.
or
There's
all his
always
tools.
stumbling blocks. There's always
Yeah.
stumbling blocks. And if you're not out for measuring a work to a millimeter grid to begin with, but what you're working with is a very highly developed sense of shape, proportion, line, and volume in your mind. That is what you relate to as you're working. You're not relating to that blueprint. And the customer will not have a laser pointer to see the straightness of the blade. He's also seeing it as a holistic object. He's appreciating the sharpness of the blade, the flexibility of the blade, the balance of the blade, and the visual harmony that it expresses. but also the beauty of the goldsmithing. And when you approach the sword from that perspective, absolute precision sort of falls a little bit backwards.
Yeah.
Today, we're a little bit anxiety, like, oh, the sword is a bit crooked, it must be badly made. This is a very, very modern mindset. And we cannot, it's very difficult for a modern mind to relate to this slight sort of unevenness. Well, what's that about? Doesn't he know what he's working with? And you forget, like, you compare it to oil painting or handwriting or pottery or anything that is made by hand, by heart, by mind, by human touch and process. The beauty of it is not in the precise measurements. It is in how everything comes together.
Yeah, it's
And
a
that's
lot
why
of sense.
I want to be a little bit careful in explaining all the unevenness as intended functional aspects of the sword, like the slightly crooked pommel. I'm not
Mhm.
fully aboard with Roland's example there. I think he's onto something. It could absolutely be something that was intentional sometimes, but I think it's a mistake to always assume it was intentional.
Okay.
Because I, as a swordsmith, I know how easy it is to get a 2 degrees off of a pommel as you do the final peening, because it comes to place and then it was straight and then in the last bit it twists. Like, damn it. It's very common. I think many sword makers recognize this. And
Okay.
it on the contrary, it's very difficult to have that, instead of doing it straight, which is easy to correct for, to have it just slightly crooked is actually much, much more difficult to do it consistently. So I
Okay.
think we need to approach this in with a little bit of an open mind. I think there could be something to it. I see why you want to do some Vikings hilts slightly asymmetrical for better ergonomics. Absolutely, we need to consider this, but we shouldn't be too quick in explaining them from just one perspective of functional sort of reason.
Okay. Very interesting. We'll quickly, Eric, yes, we will be talking about Peter's more recent and current work. So don't worry, we'll get to it. Bellatrix mentioned quickly falchions earlier when talking, and James follows up with "Don't even go there. It's a silly place," which, in terms of design, perhaps. How do you feel about typologies that don't fit within this kind of symmetrical or geometric design, or do you think they do, or is there a reason why certain kinds of swords maybe fall outside of it?
I don't follow. Is
If,
there
if
an assumption that the falchion doesn't conform to this? Because it does.
I think it's more the general weirdness of the shapes or the
Yeah.
very
So
broad variety.
so what I've seen so far, it's what I suggest is that when I see the falchions that I've analyzed and documented, they are very few because there are so few surviving. That's
Mhm.
again a limitation of what we can know and see. But it is striking that those few that I have analyzed, they conform to a variation of a sword layout, which is geometrical and modular. While on the other hand, those messers that I've documented and analyzed, they tend to be not so much geometrical, but more modular. And this is another hour of explanation. How can you see one is geometrical and one is modular? For one case, the geometrical very easily involves some irrational numbers, as I've said, golden section, root 2, root 3. With a modular layout, you may get some of these, but it's much easier to say, okay, I can see now how the blade width is 1/5 of the guard width. The blade length divided in 4 gives you the hilt length. And that's basically what you need to make a messer. And then perhaps the false edge is 3 of those eighths.
Yeah.
And that explains pretty much everything you need to know to do to produce this messer. So messers tend to have a modular layout. I think this goes hand in hand with the craft traditions of the knife. It's not just that they are made constructionally like a knife. Maybe it's excitingly enough that they are actually also designed like a knife.
Mm,
based on a modular system rather than a geometrical system.
okay.
While falchions are hilted like a sword, and they're also designed, it seems like, a sword using a geometrical layout.
Interesting. I wonder how this fits into, maybe James can chime in here into his typology that diversifies Messer and falchion based on the hilt as far as like on the rather than on the blade shape. But we'll go through other comments
Well,
because I have people.
the falchion is a sword-hilted single-edged blade. The
Yes,
messer is a knife-hilted single-edged
yes,
blade. And then we
exactly.
have James's fantastic typology of various blade shapes and pommel shapes and guard shapes.
Yeah,
But that's really something you need to talk to James about, because I
yeah.
only follow him and try to absorb as much as possible of his observations.
Yeah, we'll see if he chimes in. In the meantime, we had question by Adam Izibet. So I think you maybe already answered it a little, but does this
Yes.
geometric design apply to daggers and as well?
Yes, as far as I can tell, again, this is a smaller amount of material, so I have to be careful there. But the symmetrical double-edged dagger, and even the single-edged symmetrical dagger, seems to follow a geometric layout. When you have daggers that are more knife-like in character, you can see a modular approach. There,
Okay.
this you need more study, but there seems to be those who made knives and daggers. They seem to be part of the same overall craft tradition. Again, it's nothing special. It's nothing magical like that. Of
Yeah.
course, back in the day they thought it was magical, but it's just how a way to learn to think about shape that for us
Mhm.
today seems very strange and alien. But if this is your schooling, it's very straightforward.
Yeah. I think James thinks you may have be raising some waves in the sword pop culture with your comments on Ulfbert's swords,
Yeah.
perhaps not being the pinnacle of quality.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
I think I've touched on that enough already. I mean, that's a discussion by itself. I
yeah,
think, yes, they are very interesting. They are absolutely special, but perhaps not special in the way we think. And there are many special swords that are not observed because they don't have an inscription. I like to imagine that we, in a far future, after everything has gone to smithereens, we find the 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 sheet metal from Toyota pickup trucks with the Toyota stamped in the back. So those must have been the very best of cars.
yeah,
They're spread all over the place, and you can recognize Toyota. They must have been the best. It's a
yeah,
little bit of the same kind of thinking. I know I'm making fun of this, and it's not really, uh, you know, I'm not making an honest argument here, but I'm just saying it's I like to invite a little bit of a more open mind. There is
yeah,
reason to think that there is more going into the making of these swords than are sometimes taken for granted.
yeah. And we have two more quick comments, one by Slobodan again. It's nice to hear that even medieval sword makers used to struggle with deadlines. Not only sword makers, I think. And again, James, he also is not the only one who has pommels go offline by accident. So no, you are in good company.
Thank you. That's good to
Uh,
know.
and before we move on to your more modern production, we have some last comments by James again. So agree that the falchion is being designed like a sword. And partly he thinks it's about it making it palatable in terms of it being a little bit profane compared to the two-edged sword of God, in the words of Clement of Alexandria.
Yeah,
So
could absolutely be that. I mean, the single-edged sword has a character of its own, its own sort of mythology and symbolical meaning. You can see that there is definitely a pattern there, and I think there is there is intention and meaning behind that pattern. Um, so yeah, absolutely, and that actually leads over to this understanding, or it's yet another comment to the understanding that the sword is an object that manifests meanings and understandings. We've talked now more than an hour about how proportions is a manifestations of meanings and intentions. There is a practicality to it in communicating procedures of manufacture. There is a reason for that, but using the circle and the triangle and the square and the octagon connects to deep meanings in the mystical teachings of the Christian faith. So you can make an object magical by including these numbers and shapes in its planning. It's a kind of, again, software in its hardware, so to say. And when we approach swords today, we do not approach them as objects that simply have a form that follows function. The reason you learn swordsmanship, the reason you learn how to make swords is because there's a fascination of the overall, what the sword is, the connection to myth, to mythology, to history, to archaeology, everything that makes you imagine, and how you bring the imagined into the physical world through the making of this object. And how we understand this object will invariably color how we make it and why we make it. So the narrative, the mythology of the sword is something that is very much still alive today, and something that can also be studied and understood and sort of regarded with a critical and analytical eye.
Okay, I think this is actually the perfect moment to hop to your newer production. So everyone, the introduction is over. Now we can get into the topic of the evening.
Yes. Yeah. So yes. And so for me, things changed when I had the opportunity to do a solo exhibit in New York. This was offered to me back in 2017. And it actually really started earlier than that, back in 2014 and 15, when I was co-curator of an exhibition at the Deutsches Klingenmuseum, the exhibition The Sword, Form and Thought. And part of that exhibition was to also invite contemporary makers to make swords that involve both thought and form. So make a sword on a theme, and the theme for those swords was the xyphos, the word xyphos, not to make a antique classical Greek double-edged sword, but to reinterpret the word xyphos. And if you make it as a play of word, you can make it as xy and phos. Xy meaning going through, penetrating, and phos, of course, being light. So lightsaber, if you like, penetrating light. If you imagine the sword manifesting the meaning or the concept of penetrating light, what do you make as a maker today? That was the assignment for a few makers. And I had the opportunity to include myself in that number of makers. I couldn't skip the chance. So I made a sword that intentionally wasn't a historical sword. It wasn't a Viking sword or a 13th century sword. I wanted it to be impossible to classify according to oakshot or put in a historical period or a known culture. I wanted to be more archetypical, if you like, more timeless than time connected. So that was my first sort of strongly expressed sword like that. And this sort of funneled into this offer to make a solo exhibit at Holster Fine Arts. And I worked full-time, 3 years, making 8 swords and 3 daggers that were then included in this goddess project. Every sword was dedicated to a goddess from the Greek mythology, or actually one of the 3 Furies. The daggers were made for the Furies. And I wanted the swords to be swords that invited reflection and contemplation. You know that letter from Cassiodorus, we all know it, the old quote, the emperor is given swords from a king, and Cassiodorus writes a letter saying, thank you for these fantastic swords, the golds of the hilt are splendid, but I value the steel of the blade much more. And then he says something like, the clarity of the blade is a faithful reflection of whomever watches, the face of whoever sees the sword. And I think there is something going beyond the mere reflection here, because the sword reflects the person who holds it. We like to say that power corrupts, but what power really does is reveal. So when you give someone power, they show you who they truly are. And the sword is an object of power. When you give someone a sword, it's a kind of a talisman. The magical function of a talisman is to multiply or increase aspects of something that is already existent in a person. The sword is in that way a talisman. It makes you more of who you already are, and that's why it is a reflection. And it behooves us, when we deal with swords as makers or as students of the fencing, to actually think about, who am I using this sword? Why am I using this sword? What is it that is so fascinating with the sword? What is the power that I'm feeling? Is it something that I should give into? Is it something I should school? Is it something I should master? Because it tells me something true about myself. And I wanted to make swords that perhaps started to invite these kind of reflections. That's why the exhibition was called Reflections, Dedication to the Goddess. And that approach to making swords pretty much changed everything. It turned out to be possible to make swords that were more obviously also responding to their role as narrative and carrier of meaning and sort of artifacts of art, as much as they were weapons. And when I make them as timeless objects, you cannot just simply say, oh, that's a Viking sword, how cute. Do you sell these on medieval markets? You have to explain it in some other way. So what is this? And as the viewer sees this sword, they have to explain that sword. And by doing that, they have also explained themselves. And the sword becomes a little bit part of themselves. They have identified, recognized something in the sword, and that comes out as the explanation. And I see that as something very interesting. The sword can fulfill a role today as a cultural artifact, just like obviously it does in Japan, because that continuum is still open, it's still part of the culture. We have a little bit divorced ourselves from that part, that function of the sword. That's why we're a little bit fumbly when we try to approach the sword as something more than just form follows function.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We have first a comment by August Wirth. So I absolutely have seen people's personalities represented in the way they wield the sword.
Yep. You see that time and time again.
And that was, of course, true. I guess it's probably good description of the fighter types we have in treatises and stuff as well. So it's personal, but then you can also build groups out of how people use sword. One question I have about this series of swords you made, is it just a general group of swords that invites reflection, or does each one in your point of view as a maker convey something different? Why are they different amongst each other? And
yeah, well, I guess that's what I'm trying to find out.
yeah.
You have to, but both are true in one way. I guess you can connect the swords I do now to the group of the goddess swords, even though I don't really regard them as goddess swords anymore. But they are made with the same intention. But now, unless I make like a small group of swords that belong together, they don't really belong together more than you can say a series of novels belong together because they're written by the same author.
Yeah.
So of course you can see some themes and some ideas being repeated. I use some similar approaches, but it's also the case that since it's not an exhibition anymore, every sword has to speak for itself to a higher degree to have a reason for its existence. One example is One of the latest sword I made was the one I called chronokoptis, which is a kind of a construction from Greek, meaning time cutter. It's a single-edged sword that is a little bit like a Balkan Iron Age curved sword, or a falcata, or a kopis. It's one of those inverted kukri kind of blades, but not similar to any in detail, but you recognize it as the type. And that comes from, the idea comes from the ancient myth of Gaia and Uranos. Gaia made the first sword called harpe, the sharpest of blades, and he made it to to get divorce from her brother Uranos, the sky god, and she put the task to Kronos, their child. So Kronos cut off a vital part of his father, so he couldn't no longer couple with Gaia, and he threw that part into the sea, which gave birth to Venus, and the blood that stained the ground gave birth to the Furies. And with that cut of the sword, the sky was now divorced from Earth, which gives room for the sun to rise and go down, for the movement of everything, and for place for everything to live. So that cut started time.
Yeah.
That's why it's the sharpest of blades. And it's still, when you see the old man who gives the new year over to the child, that's another manifestation of Kronos, and he has that curved blade. It's just in the shape of a scythe. But on Greek vase paintings, it's a sickle, because it's used also by Perseus when he beheads the Medusa. It's also lent to Zeus himself when he battles the monster Python. No, not Python. One of the other monsters. It's used time and time again as one of those monster-killing blades.
Yeah.
And I wanted to make a sword based on that myth, a very dark myth, but also a comment to like the basic cruelty of existence that makes life possible in a way. So it became this sickle-shaped sword. That so the myth and the sketching, the ancient sword models that are sort of contemporary to and perhaps comments to that inverted edge, were sort of mushed together and came out as this chronocoptis. It's just an example of the process that every sword goes through.
And it's really interesting because in mythology, at least when I was reading it as a kid, the importance is in the gesture of Kronos, so the cutting of the part, but not in the object it's used to cut. So if we go back to what you were saying about the social importance and the function of the sword as an object, here we have it basically as the object that gives origin to the universe and time.
Yes.
And so it's really, really important.
And it's not unique. Swords are used in the act of creation in many mythologies. The slaying of a dragon, the slaying of a giant, or even in the Bible. Even if it doesn't sort of create the world, but it brings mankind into the world through the flaming sword that prohibits us the existence in the Eden of the garden. We also know that the world, according to Christian mythology, is created through the word of God. And in the medieval illumination, that explains all the equipment of the Christian knight as symbolical weapons of the Christian. That symbolical knight, who is the good Christian, the sword he holds in his hand, is mentioned verbum Dei. So he fights. The sword is the word of God. So again, we have the connection to creation with the sword, both being connected to the word of God. So the sword is very archetypical, very, very ancient in sort of our understanding of how the world comes together.
And across different cultures, that's really...
Yes, it seems to be somehow universal.
So there's a question by Eric again. He's curious about that artistic shift in your work. So was the move away from strictly historical pieces an abrupt change that started with the Xephos project?
Well, it was the outside was very abrupt, of course. I thought I was going to commit some kind of professional suicide when I did this. So it wasn't an easy or obvious thing to do, but at the same time, I felt I had to do it because when I made the historical studies of the sword, all of these things were still very active for me. It just wasn't at all obvious. You had to see, you had to know the sword as a mythological, narrative, cultural artifact to see this in the medieval sword. So in a way, I was doing myself and everyone else a disfavor of not actually manifesting that which I think is a very important part of the sword in my art and my craft. So in a way, it was like a coming out to say, okay, but this is what I'm really about. But to do this, to be able to do these swords, I had to spend, a couple of decades studying the historical sword from the Bronze Age to Renaissance to wrap my mind around what a sword is, both sort of aesthetically, symbolically, functionally, craft-wise, and to get an idea of these different aspects to tell the story with my own voice by internalizing these things and sort of meshing them together in a way that feels uh, integral and integral to the story I want to tell.
Mm. Yeah, I think August did notice that. He mentions in your process, following your process. We have a question by Slobodan again. So yeah, it's very nice to hear about the connection between person and sword. When we talk about medieval modules, what would you suggest that a medieval sword maker would use as a module?
Well, again, the module is scalable. So you can go about this in many different ways. We have, for example, you can think about the Vitruvian Man. What is that? Well, we all know about the Leonardo da Vinci image. It's not about the golden section that everyone makes it out to be. There's only one instant of the golden section, and it's not exact. And that's the position of the navel to the overall height. Everything else is whole number divisions of the body. So the width of the shoulders is a quarter of the total length. The height of the head is an eighth. The height of the face is 1/10, and so forth and so forth. So it just goes to show that every part of the human body in an ideal proportion is commensurable to the overall. It fits elegantly to a whole number fraction. And this has been fascinating to people from very, very ancient times. The Ark of Noah and the Ark of the Covenant are also modular buildings because of this. And so you can start with the human anatomy. Say you have studied sword making, so you already have like a little library of these, say, strategies. A long cavalry sword will typically have, I'm just making numbers up now, but say the blade is no, that's too much, 8-1. That's a very long bladed cavalry sword. So your customer, he wants a good war sword, a big sword. And you're in a time period where that is a single-handed sword, but with a long blade. So how long, sir, how long would the sword be? Well, I prefer it to be my arm length, says the customer, because his fencing teacher taught him that that's the ideal length of a sword. You'll find many other ideals, but say that's what he was taught. So now the sword maker knows that I divide this arm length in 8 parts. That will give me the hilt. And now I can divide the hilt in 4 parts, and that will give me the diameter of the pommel. If I divide the hilt in 3 parts and multiply that part by 4, perhaps that's my guard width. And perhaps that fourth is also my blade width or the third of the hilt. That's a way to build a sword design based on modular units that actually corresponds to an exact dimension of an individual. If you already have that modular design in your head, you can go to the next customer who has a little bit of a shorter or longer arm, and you scale your sword accordingly. So that's how I don't know if I managed to explain this clear. It's so much easier when you can draw. But it's very straightforward. If you know what to divide with and how to multiply and how it corresponds to some basic sword types, you very easily and quickly recognize these patterns. If you're introduced to these ideas and goes to a museum, you will see the triangle and you will see the square and you will see that most of the long swords are 1 to 4. It's very, very common. So you can start to recognize these patterns, and it's just there.
Okay, we have one more. First, Jeff Hardy is saying bye because he can't stay, so it's time. And we have one more question by Slobodan, but before we, well, actually, no, maybe let's. No, actually, well, I have one question first, which is,
Yeah.
speaking of like long cavalry swords, and you mentioned before that this kind of geometric approach disappears with the late Middle Ages. Okay, that's the question. Where do we have the like tail end of it? Until when
I
do
don't
you see
know.
it?
I don't
Okay.
know, because my study ends at the Renaissance.
Okay.
And we have the play from 1630 something.
Yeah.
It was still talked about that. Then I have studied rapiers. They seem to be both modular and perhaps overall like cohesive geometrical. But then we have a time when the hilt is very much separate and the blade is just added.
Yeah.
There seems possibly that there is less of an overall geometry with rapiers, but then again, we know that most rapiers in modern collections are re-hilted by antique dealers and curators. So there's a disturbance in the field that I can feel here. So again, it's the more complex a hilt becomes, the more difficult it is to say, yes, it's geometry or modular, because by necessity, it becomes a more complex system. And the more complex it is, the more variances and excuses you can find. So it's much more straightforward and easy to show in a simple cruciform sword than it is in the rapier.
Yeah.
Although I see tendencies for it, and it's very much in the thinking of the time, so I should expect it to be a case. You can, for example, see there's many situations where you have artists who have made sword designs, very fanciful, with dolphins and dragons and little putties and angels and demons. And as a rule, we even have cases where that design has been made into a rapier. It's then interesting to see that something changes from the artist's freehand design to the completed rapier hilt, because it's much more strictly made. It's not that it's more symmetrical. It's just more somehow orderly and unified.
Yeah.
And I think that is because the cutler or the hilt maker who made the hilt is schooled in this way of thinking. He can take a freehand sketch, just like I do in my sketchbooks. I draw freehand all the time. I find something that I see, well, that's nice. Let's see how I can tune this up. And then I work it through modular or geometrical designs until I get it to fit just right with a minimum of definitions involved. And then it tends to be the most beautiful. And I think that's pretty much also how a rapier maker would have worked from an artist sketch back in the 17th century. But I cannot say this is the case because I haven't studied the field enough, and the material is full of complexity and uncertainties.
Okay. Thank you. And here we have the question that Slobodan asks for me because it was going to come next. But yeah, it would be interesting to hear how Peter starts what your process is, how you're.
Yeah. So, okay, in short, when I draw a sword in my sketchbook, I know that, okay, this is going to be a medium length sword, which means something like 60 to 80 centimeter blade length. At this it's a pretty big variance. And then I draw a hilt to roughly the scale. Maybe it turns out to be much more beautiful as a dagger. Okay, then I make the blade slightly shorter in proportion to the hilt. How big should I make the design? Well, then I know, okay, with this kind of sketch, maybe I even made a crisp drawing on my computer with a very precise proportional system. I still haven't decided exactly how big this dagger or sword should be. So I think, okay, in this case, I need the hilt, the grip, to be 9 centimeters wide. So then I just scale my drawing until I have 9 centimeters in the hilt, in the grip, and then that decides the overall. So that's how you do it when you work on a computer. It's very easy to just, after the, if I work on pen and paper only, maybe I take a step aside at an earlier stage and think like, okay, if I make this to this scale, saying, okay, I need to have the grip 9 or perhaps 10 centimeters. What would that mean for the blade width and pommel? And then I can make a quick assumption. Well, like the blade is like 2/3 of the grip length. Then I know close enough to how wide this blade is. How long is it? That will already tell me, with this width and this length, will tell me something about how thick it has to be, or rather how thin it has to be, not to be too heavy. So you can go back and forth to think about functional aspects like ergonomics, grip length, about consequences in blade weight. Do I have to make the pommel hollow? Does it have to be very thin with this size? Or has it to be very thick because I can only make it this big? So you can go backwards and forwards in your thinking. And so it's not just about choosing the dimension of a circle. That's not how you do it. You work with proportions and you see what kind of consequences it has for your final design. And you can scale it up, you can scale it down, you can shift things around. But when you do that, you do it according to a certain pattern and system of using module or geometrical cuts. And I know this sounds terribly complex, but it's like, once you've become accustomed to using this sort of limit for your thinking, I can only use, it's like building with Lego pieces. I can only use I can't use anything in between. These are only the allowed things.
Yeah.
It's not so much of a stricture, it's more of a creative push, that I have to do it like this or like this, and now I have to be creative to find a solution. And that creative spark actually forces you to think perhaps in a new curve, a new solution. And it's beneficial to the process rather than limiting.
Um, you mentioned pommel thickness, and
Mhm.
so the three-dimensionality of the blade that you already, or of the sword that you already mentioned before, that's, if I understand correctly, where we can play
Yeah,
distributing weights and stuff to
exactly.
then make the sword functional. Okay.
Exactly. So you can make the pommel thinner or thicker. You can change the cross section. You can hollow it out on the outside or the inside.
Yeah.
And the same way with the blade, you can work with grooves and fullers. You can work with different cross sections. And this is why you already have to know how to make a sword to be able to properly implement these principles.
Mhm.
Because geometry and modularity doesn't teach you how to make a well-balanced sword. You have to know how to do that to properly, or in the best way, implement these ideas.
I think you may have answered the next questions that were from Marston here, late to the party, so I think he missed quite a bit of the conversation before, but as someone that cares more for form, following function,
Mhm.
does Peter still hold his opinion that swords were designed with geometrical proportions in mind? And then he continues, or more correctly, how strong is this assertion?
Yeah, so to touch on this again, form follows function is a term minted by modernistic architects in the 20th century. It's a way to, it's a part of the manifesto of modernistic architecture and design. That everything you see, everything that is incorporated in the piece, in the object, in the artifact, should be explained by or a consequence of the intended function. This is not how a historical artisan thought about the creative process or the object in itself. And when I send a function, it's then just a mechanical, tactical function of a weapon or a tool or an artifact that has a use. If we include the function of narrative, symbolical, religious, mystical, cosmological function of an object, well, then absolutely form follows function. But only we include all of these things. And if we do exclude these things from the sword, seeing it only as a cutting implement or thrusting implement, I would say it's no longer a sword. A sword has to be all of these things to truly be a sword. Otherwise, it is really just a sharpened bar of steel. And that's just that stupid simplification that all of us knows it's not a true description of what a sword is.
And thank you. And he continues with, last while I was typing that I don't find the geometric approach to work. As we move towards the 1500s, I hear that he thinks so too. So I think he joined in at that point.
No, it's not that it doesn't work. It's just that I'm careful about making statements because the analysis tends to break down when the object becomes very, very complex. I can show you many analysis of rapiers and even later military swords. But if you're already hesitant about how to approach geometric design with a simple, I'm not trying to sound arrogant here, but if it's an alien way of thinking, when you see examples of medieval swords, I'm sure it will be completely confusing when you see this analysis being done on a rapier, because it's a very three-dimensional and it's a very detailed object. It has to have many definitions to even make use of the definition.
Mhm.
And then again, I cannot be sure. I must be less sure about my analysis of later period pieces because they have been interfered with by curators and collectors to a much greater degree than the medieval sword has. So it's not that it doesn't work anymore. I do think it's part of the tradition of making swords up till industrial times. When swords start to equate bayonets, it's no longer really reasonable to make them in this way anymore. But I think for quite a long while, it is still in some way part of the tradition, even though, of course, it's watered down and sort of fades in importance. But, timbermen, roof layers, many of these crafts are still using geometry into the 19th and 20th century. You can still go to schools in France today to learn the proper way to use geometry in planning the timbers of a roof. It's an advanced application of geometry. It's a trained way of thinking in spatial terms. You can't just expect that you grasp it like this. It's not like hearing a language spoken and then being able to speak it yourself. It takes a bit of study, but it's not mystical. It's not impossible, and it's not very hard. It just takes a little bit of while to start to see how it works. And it's so much easier to do if you actually have a teacher who knows how to do it. I could show Marston in 2 hours how to do the basic layouts, and I'm sure he would get it. He could start to use it himself.
So speaking of which, you do have workshops.
Yes, I do. I do. And this is, of course, part of the workshop. How to think about the sword, how to design it, why we make swords today, and how we may apply a medieval thinking in and also in the design. And I'm always careful saying that this is a working hypothesis. I do believe I have a good reason to suggest this is how they did it, but it is a work in progress. And I'm welcoming, critical comments, and I don't believe this, but I do expect people who expect me to give them a response, to actually have read up on the subject. Just because you're unfamiliar with geometry, just because you haven't worked with geometry yourself, and there because of that can't see how you can't use it, that's not a good argument to saying they couldn't have used it in the medieval times, because this is part of classical art and craft training. And if you have learned it, it's much easier to see how you can apply it.
Hmm. So before we start winding down, because you mentioned an hour, we're already getting to the two. So sorry about
Sorry about
that.
that.
Yeah. I'm happy. I can go on forever, but
Me
the
too, obviously.
okay. So I'll just make a last call for questions. And in the meantime, I want to quickly ask you because we looked at the history, we looked at the high art in a sense, like the very philosophically backed approach, let's say, that you have today. But you also designed swords for TV shows or for more practical pop purposes, let's say. Uh,
Rarely, but
did
yes.
yeah, did this change your process, or do you always go with the same kind of mindset into designing even something that isn't meant for?
Well, I designed the sword for the Arn movie. That was very early on. At that time, I
Hmm.
still used my pocket calculator in calculating the
Mm.
proportions based on a blade length. So even though it has sort of the proportions of a medieval sword, it's from a flawed process. It's not from the sort of medieval process that I believe geometry is much closer to being.
Hmm.
When I made the sword for House of the Dragon, it was a wonderful opportunity to actually use the magical overtones of geometry, but not using a Christian geometry, but of course the geometry and numerical mysticism of this world, where the number seven has a important role, of course, because of the seven gods.
Hmm.
So the story we made for the swords for the TV series is that they are ancient family blades of the Targaryens, but they were re-hilted in occasion when the seven kingdoms had been sort of conquered. And at that occasion, they were given a symbology that conforms to the religion of the place. So the blades were hilted in a way that resonances with the sevenfold symmetry. So a circle with a seven-pointed star inscribed, which is then the circle is also the hilt length. That gives you all the width of all the parts, and it gives you the height of the pommel, the width of the pommel. All the parts are then defined by that inscribed seven-pointed star because it's magic, because these
Hmm.
are magical swords. And so, yes, I could very much use the principles, but you have to rethink it. You have to do it from the mindset of someone who lives in this world using this kind of mythology and magic. And it was a fun game to play.
Yeah,
It's
sounds
also
like.
a world where, like in Tolkien's world, it's kind of inverted history that everything that is ancient is always much, much better. And things that are contemporary are just getting worse and worse and worse.
Mhm.
So the very sort of fatalistic and dark view of history that may be very true. So these swords, since they're ancient swords, the blades are very old, they have to look sort of very advanced and modern. So that's why I wanted to have them be inspired more like from 16th century blades than 13th century blades. Hence
Mhm.
the hollow ground ricassos and the narrow grooves and all of those things are like a subtle hint that this is from a different mindset, a different time period than the rest of the swords in the series.
Interesting. So we have here, I think, an interesting comment on the approach you mentioned, which Slobodan came up with, which is, yeah, the geometric way is like Neo and the red pill in the Matrix. So suddenly it decodes, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
suddenly it
and I mean
opens up.
we're dangerously close to some kind of cult mentality here. I mean, it's fun in a way because this is mysticism, this is magic, and you have to be very clear about that. To use this properly, we need to keep the critical part of our mind still in gear, and look at because once you start to use this, it's so much fun. It'll suck you in. It'll start to explain things, and maybe some of these explanations are maybe not the ones you should jump to. So we need to keep a little bit at a distance at the same time as we, you know, go into it and look at it and twist and turn things. But yes, it is a red pill effect. I experienced that very powerfully when I saw that Söborg sword fit to a simple overall geometry. And the subsequent like 4 months when I read up on Gothic architecture, like the studies of Robert Bork, who is an architectural professor at the Iowa University, and other architectural historians, and try to see what do we know really, and reading up on these handbooks from the 15th century, you could start to feel the brain getting rewired, so to say. It was almost like a workout ache the next morning, and it really changed the way I looked on swords and how I make swords and how I understand swords. For me, it was a fundamental shift. Absolutely.
We have a reply by Marston. So, using a side sword martially, I want the pommel to be at the base of my hand, while quillins,
Mhm.
finger rings, and sweeps of a certain size. These are not connected in proportion as in the past.
No, but you can, knowing this, you can make a design that meets the sort of the dimensional criteria of a certain person's body size. Just because you know that you want the grip to be a certain length and the pommel to be a certain size, this is for me in no way limiting to applying an overall geometry or modularity to the sword. Absolutely not. Just that for you, for Marston, the first thing you think about is that, well, form follows function. I need to have a certain size in my hand, otherwise the sword doesn't work. Of course, I completely agree with that. But it's absolutely not an argument that it couldn't be modular in its overall design. It's just, how you apply these ideas and say you already decided this is the grip length, and say, I don't want the pommel to be longer than it fits inside here. Now you've given me a certain length. I can take this to be three quarters of the first circle and make a Vesica-based design where all of this can then be designed and explained geometrically. That's absolutely not a problem. It's very, very easy.
And he does, though, continue with that is how I see it, but he does like your way of thinking and artistic work quite a bit. So, um,
Well, Marston,
so
let me also thank you, because your questions are very, very good. And it's easy. I always get lost in this, as you hear. I get very verbose. And it's really important to connect to these questions, because this is obviously the first thing you wonder about. But what about dimensions? What about balance? I know what the size of the sword needs to be. So it seems like it's an obvious thing. And in a way it is, but you can still use these very important limitations for size and dimension and weight and balance and incorporate them as a dimension of the overall design, so to say.
I'm having again trouble managing comments, but I'll try and go through in a
Okay.
thematical approach. But yeah, well, first we have a comment here, a question by Tim Wagendorp. So, what areas of your art craft are you digging into nowadays? More storytelling.
Yeah, I will try to expand on and dig deeper into the sword as a narrative object. I want to push for the sword as an artifact, as an artwork. I want to strive to be an ambassador for the craft, to try to push the area where swords can be appreciated by people who didn't really yet sort of understand that they were fascinated by swords. So I want to keep making swords in this way and explore both history and archaeology and that sort of strict study of what the sword was, but also see how you can use all of that in making swords that are disconnected from that and can attract people who are new collectors of swords, new aficionados, new sort of um, supporters of this art and craft. Because I think we need to think outside of the box to have a future as blade makers. So when I do this, I also see a strong resonance in very early swords. So these days, I find perhaps most influence from Bronze Age and early Iron Age. I also seek influences from East and Central African blade work, as well as the Indonesian and Malay archipelagos. So I try to have a varied sort of diet of swords. So and try to internalize and rework these things in my mind so they come out as something else than just replicas and copies. So that's what I'm trying to work with now. Yes.
And I think still connected to what the conversation with Marsden was, Eric again adds that he appreciates that the geometric approach can also be seen strictly as designing language. It can be a design language and a set of tools in a secular context. And then he continues.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. In my own work, these tools make more sense over time, even if I engage with them differently than Peter. Cool. And we had one more question and then two more questions if you have still some time. Cool. So one is if you've investigated Iron Age Celtic longsword blades, they have such rich variety of form and iron folding technique. And some look like
of course, I've looked at Celtic blades. I've documented a number of them, not enough, not nearly enough, of course, and because they tend to lack hilts, there is a limit to how much you can say about them. So I haven't invested much time in doing systematic analysis of their proportions. It would be a waste of time. It would be just building a castle of air, because I would have to assume a lot of things about the hilt or the overall craft, since the material is fragmentary. But it's a fascinating blade culture, and it has a great influence on me, of course. How the blades are constructed metallurgically, and forging and grinding and cross-section, and the weight and the balance, they are absolutely fascinating and often misunderstood, as most swords are. So, I mean, they are incredible pieces, incredible statements, monumental in the history of the sword.
We have one suggestion, again, by Sleepy Sleep. He would love to see you talk with Neil Burridge about Bronze Age swords. It would be wonderful. So
I'd love to do that. I'd love to do that.
Oh, and damn it, more questions than I thought. Sorry. We'll try and go through them, not to keep you too long, but one here was, is there somewhere online where Cristobal can start to study this approach?
Well, I have very short introductory articles on my homepage, my website, the swordreflections.com. A little bit longer articles were printed in the Sword Form and Thought catalog from the Solingen exhibition. That is now sadly out of print. I know Six Wetzler, the head of the museum, he wants to print a third run of the catalog, but I don't think it's damaging if you write to him and say, please, pretty please, can we have the third run soon, please? Because the more interest there is in having a third run of the catalog, the more likely it is that it's printed and that it will be sooner rather than later. So in print, that catalog is the best source of information. Online, you will see people applying these ideas, sometimes closely to my suggestions and principles, sometimes very creatively according to their own means and own ideas. There is not a collected place where you can study this, unfortunately. I have been sort of collecting my material in my mind to try to publish some kind of print on demand handbook in structural, or I don't know even what to call it, like systematic design, if you like. It sounds so bloody boring and dull when you say it, but say a modular, no. Okay, the secret seal of the swordsmith. How about that? And do it as a print on demand book for blade makers. And that would be an introduction to classical design as applied to the Greek temple and the Gothic cathedral and other arts and crafts, and how you can see those being made and what patterns I see in swords. And then like a kind of a handbook where each strategy is presented by itself, and then some examples of how you can apply them. and also some ideas of how to work with brainstorming, how to work with strictures and limitations, and how that can provoke new creative ideas. So not just simply how to make the medieval sword, so to say, but also how to use these like lessons in developing your own language and your own thinking in a systematical way.
You already have one sure customer here in the comments, two with me, and I'm sure a lot of other
Great.
people.
Thank you. Thank you. That would be
Actually,
great.
answers, it's not existing yet, but it answers a question by George about sword
Hmm.
documentation. So do you
Yeah.
have any tips on existing?
Well, first off, you need to approach collectors and museums with the clear understanding they don't have time to accept you. Although in many cases they would like to, they are limited in their limited salary and how many people they are working there to actually accept visitors. So accept the situation that you may very well be refused, not because you're not good enough, because just they don't have time, and that's just a limiting factor. But if you write a well-worded letter that is not arrogant, that is clear in what it is you're looking for, and why the study of a certain sword that is in their collection would be helpful in this particular study, your chances of being accepted increases. And what you're looking for then is to have a sword on a piece of paper so you can trace it. In some situations, the sword is too fragile to allow that. So it should be a fairly well-preserved sword to start with. You trace the outline as carefully as you can, perpendicular with a pencil that is not metallic, so you're not scratching or making a mark on the blade. Once you've made the outline, you correlate that outline with measurements. So you do a clean drawing already, and you're not relying on your tracing because it's going to be a bit wonky. So make a careful drawing. The more careful it is, the better it is. Look at Roland Barceja's beautiful drawings of swords. They are school examples of what you should strive for. That's brilliant work. And then you take measurements of width and thickness, for example, at every 10 centimeters. You take a note of the fuller length. You take a note of how the profile of the blade possibly changes over the length, what kind of edge angle you have, any functional feature that you may think of. Make careful note of that. And the more functional features you can think of, the better your understanding of the sword will be, and the better your next documentation will be. Look for point of balance, look for pivot points, look for nodes, if the curator allows you to do so. So it's always in communication with the curator or your host at the place. Take lots of photographs and draw the sword, especially the hilt, from all angles. So you have like a projection, like a technical drawing of what the guard looks like from all angles, and the same thing with the pommel, and take measurements. And then you have a good reference piece. And it'll take you anywhere from 1.5 to 5 hours to do one of those, depending on how complex the sword is and how quick you are.
Thank you for that. We have one more comment from James, following up from a conversation he's had with me, actually. Do you think we should try a group talk on the subject of fakes or forgeries and the problems for collectors? So don't want to put you on the spot there, but we could have.
Yeah, I would love to do that. It's a very charged and difficult topic, because the more you explain in detail what to look out for, the more you train those who make fakes. And I've already published my ideas on geometry. So any fake that is made after 2012 could be made with these ideas in mind. And some of them, I dare say, are. So it's an evolving field, and I've made experiments myself in making fake fakes, just to try out my ideas of what I think they're doing. And I see that it works. I see it's easy, and it's a much quicker work to make a sword that looks 800 years old than to make a well-finished replica of the same sword.
Mm.
It is like the practical working time for making a archaeological original is like measured in a couple of hours to 1 or 2 days, compared to several weeks for a well-made replica.
But we can talk about this then, James. Overall, it could be an interesting conversation to have. And we have one last, it's not a question, it's a request. Would you be willing to tell another medieval tale featuring a sword, perhaps to wrap things up? I think that's actually an interesting... If one comes to mind. That's usually when the mind blanks.
Yeah, now I froze. That's a unique situation for me. Sorry.
Next time,
they
then.
they have to be provoked by some kind of impulse. But there's so many sword stories you could talk about. No, I'm sorry. I will make a mess of that. So sorry, you took me with my guard down. You put me on the spot. Thank you for that. That's brilliant. I needed that.
Perfect.
Sorry to let you down.
There will be more opportunities. Actually, mentioning that is, thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
course, you're welcome anytime you want. If you have more medieval stories about swords, we can make a whole episode about that. So
yes, absolutely. No, there was great fun. I know I'm rambling, and I sorry about that, but thank you all of you who listened to this and who will listen to this and stay to this very end. I'm impressed. So I try to answer emails. So if you write to me via my homepage, I try to answer. I do hold classes, and I post them on Instagram and Facebook. The next upcoming one will be in October, I think. Check my page. In southern Sweden, and the topic will then be the medieval messer. Will be great fun. Hope to see some of you there. And next year we will do more classes in south of Sweden. So exciting things coming up. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a nice rest of the evening, and everyone else as well. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.